I'd like to yield to gentleman from Texas, Mr. Conaway. Thank you for being here and looking forward to your comments.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. I appreciate being here to participate in the Constitution Caucus's comments on our Constitution. We labor under the sometimes, or mostly all times, misguided idea that we're the smartest people who ever walked the face of the earth, and that no new ideas are created except through us. And sometimes it's helpful to look back at some of the things folks who've gone on before us have said, and to help us reflect on those and see how they apply to today's circumstances. A couple of those things. One is from a speech that Robert Kennedy made on the Day of Affirmation address that he did in South Africa back in 1966. And while much of what he talked about, the revolution of youth and the civil rights movement and other things are not germane to what we're talking about tonight, there is a section that is particularly relevant to this conversation, and I would like to read into the record his comments on some of those early paragraphs. He started off by saying, "We stand here in the name of freedom." Freedom is that wonderful word that conjures up inside of all of us those kinds of feelings that are unique to just certain words. Liberty is another word that does that. It has that kind of visceral experience inside each one of us. It's different, but nonetheless inspiring almost every single time you hear that. Kennedy went on to say, "At the heart of that Western freedom and democracy is the belief that the individual man, the child of God, is a touchstone of value, and all societies, groups, the state, exist for his benefit. Therefore, the enlargement of liberty for individual human beings must be the supreme goal in the abiding practice of any Western society." The first element of this individual liberty is the freedom of speech, the right to express and communicate ideas, to set oneself apart from the dumb beasts of the field and the forest, to recall governments to their duties and obligations. Above all, the right to affirm one's membership and allegiance to the body politic and to society, to men with whom we share land, our heritage, and our children's future. The essential humanity of men can be protected and preserved only where government must answer, not just to the wealthy, not just to those of a particular religion or a particular race, but to all people. And even government, by the consent of the governed, as in our Constitution, must be limited in its power to act against its people, so that there may be no interference with the right to worship or with the security of the home, no arbitrary imposition of pains and penalties by high officials or low, no restrictions on the freedom of men to seek education or work or opportunity of any kind, so that each man may become all he is capable of becoming. These are the sacred rights of Western society. Senator Kennedy got it right. These are the sacred rights of Western society, and we are in danger of having those rights trampled on by this continued growth in the size of our federal government. If you look at the trajectory that we find ourselves on from a financial standpoint, you can have estimates by think tanks on the left, estimates by think tanks on the right, the CBO, the GAO, all of these have 75-plus year projections of the path that we are currently on. If you stacked each of those projections on a light table to look through all of them at the same time, there's not a chigger's whisker difference between the path that we're on. Nobody disagrees that the path that we're on is absolutely unsustainable. I tell my constituents back home, we're very much like the fellow who fell off the 10-story building. As he passed the 5th floor, he said, "So far, so good. So far, so good." Well, we are that guy. And although our financial wreck is 10, 15, 20 years down the road, we are in a free fall that has an abrupt, immediate stop somewhere in our future. We are bright, intelligent, smart, individual people, present company accepted. We ought to be able to look at those projections, Mr. Speaker, and take action. We have for 5 years now, 6 years this summer, August, failed to reform Social Security. When I first joined Congress in 2005, that was one of the leading issues on our table at that time. And yes, we got distracted with whether or not part of it should be personally owned and part of it should not. But at the end of the day, we had a predicate, set the predicate for why Social Security needed to be adjusted. Most of us spent that first 8 years trying to lay out to our constituents exactly what the issues were that are familiar with all of us in this chamber. That lasted until the end of August 2005, and then Hurricane Katrina happened and distracted us from the goal of getting it done, and we've not touched Social Security since. We've continued to choose each and every year to not adjust and not renegotiate Social Security. That choice has a consequence, and the consequence is that we're adding about $600 billion of unfunded mandates to the debt of future generations of Americans because we choose not to take action. That choice is ours to take. It is our freedoms to take that choice. It's our liberty to take that choice. But collectively, both sides of the aisle, this isn't a Republican issue or a Democrat issue, both sides of the aisle have, for good or for bad, I would argue for ill, chosen to not address a fundamental spending issue that's among those that we have to face, I would argue, is the least difficult. Let me finish with a quote from George Washington in his first inaugural address. George Washington declared, "The preservation of the sacred fire of liberty, the destiny of the Republican model of government are finally staked on the experiment and trusted to the hands of the American people. Trust is placed in the people precisely because they are, in the words of the Declaration, equally created and endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights." We have that precious gift in our hands. Those of us, the 435 of us who get to vote in this House, the 100 on the other side of this building who get to vote, the man and woman who occupies 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, we have the tools of choice in our hands. Do we choose to preserve liberty and freedom for future generations, or do we choose to continue, as that fellow falling off the 10-story building said, so far so good, so far so good? I argue that we should not. I argue that let's use our intellect, let's use our will, let's use the wisdom of the American people who last November made a pretty dramatic statement as to what they thought we ought to do. We now need to take those reins of choice in our hands and lead this nation to a sustainable federal government that does not mortgage our grandchildren's future, does not hand off to them an America that is less prosperous, with less opportunity for standard of living increases that you and I enjoyed as we stepped into adulthood. If we choose to continue to ignore the problem and stick our head in the sand, as the ostrich sometimes does, pretty unflattering position, quite frankly, for any of us, including the ostrich, if we choose to do that, then future generations will simply say, why did they do that? They saw it coming. They understood the consequences. They had within their power the ability to make it different. And we have chosen so far to not do that. We have chosen so far to expand federal government at an unprecedented rate. We have chosen to take away from states the rights to conduct those affairs of our individual lives that are properly left to the states and to our local governments, or quite frankly left to us alone as individuals. We have chosen as a federal government, as a nation, to empower this federal government year in and year out to take away our freedoms and our liberties. All I can say to that, Mr. Speaker, is shame on us. Shame on us if we don't right this ship of state by shrinking the size of this government, limiting what it does in our day-to-day lives, getting back to the fundamental founding principles that our founding fathers built this country on, and that is a limited federal government with limited powers, everything else being reserved to the states and or local municipalities, or not at all, and left to the people. So, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the opportunity to express these comments tonight, and I yield back.